Have you ever stood somewhere so cold, so still, that you could hear your own breath? Have you ever looked across a wide, empty sky and wondered if someone out there was carrying the weight of everything you'll never see? Maybe you haven't thought about it lately. Maybe today, we can remember. There was a time, not so long ago, when the world sat on the edge of something terrible. The winter of 1950 in Korea was not just cold, it was merciless. The sky above Chosin Reservoir stretched wide and silent, a ceiling of gray, heavy with promises it would never keep. Down below, men fought battles they couldn't win, in a place they didn't understand, for people they would never meet. Up in the sky, the battles were lonelier still. Among the clouds and the frost flew two men whose lives could not have been more different. One was a young officer from New England, born into comfort but carrying a restless spirit he couldn't explain. The other, the son of Mississippi sharecroppers, who had clawed his way into a cockpit no one wanted him to occupy. They weren't meant to be friends. In another world, they might never have spoken at all. But war is a strange place, it doesn't ask permission before stitching two souls together. On that day, above the frozen hills of Chosin, Lieutenant Thomas Hudner and Ensign Chosin L. Brown would write a story not with speeches or grand battles, but with something much rarer, a quiet kind of courage. None of them knew yet. None of them could have known. But the sky was already changing. Chosin L. Brown had been chasing the sky long before he ever saw it up close. Born in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, the son of a sharecropper and a schoolteacher, Chosin grew up with a world on his shoulders and a dream everyone told him he couldn't reach. In a time when few doors opened for a black man, he found one, through persistence, through sacrifice, through a belief that some things were worth fighting for even if no one else believed it. He worked odd jobs to pay for flying lessons, saving every nickel he could find. He studied harder than anyone else at Ohio State, his textbooks worn and secondhand, but always clutched tight to his chest like they were made of gold. People stared when he walked into a classroom. They whispered when he showed up on the tarmac. But Chosin kept walking. Kept flying. Kept rising. And then there was Thomas Hudner. Born into a well-respected family in Fall River, Massachusetts, Thomas had grown up with expectations instead of barriers. His path to a Navy commission was almost carved out for him before he even knew he wanted it. But it wasn't the medals or the ranks that called to him. It was something quieter, the idea that service wasn't about glory. It was about doing something that mattered. They met in Fighter Squadron 32, both standing beneath the same endless stretch of gray sky, wearing the same crisp uniform, yet carrying different battles inside. Chosin didn't ask for favors. He didn't want sympathy. And Thomas didn't offer any. What grew between them wasn't built on speeches or declarations. It was built in the way Thomas moved aside so Chosin didn't always have to walk behind. In the way Chosin shared half a chocolate bar with Thomas during a long watch without saying a word. Their friendship wasn't the kind you'd read about in history books. It was quieter, stitched together by respect, by hours spent maintaining planes, by trust formed not through grand gestures but through the simple fact that when you flew, your life depended on the man beside you. One cold morning, as they prepared for another mission, Thomas tightened the straps on his parachute harness. Beside him, Chosin checked the gauges on his Corsair with the kind of care a man gives to something he loves, not just something he uses. Thomas glanced over and said, almost casually, "You ready for this, Chosin?" Chosin smiled without looking up. "Was born ready, sir." Thomas chuckled under his breath and turned back to his own checklist. But somewhere deep inside, he knew, some men carried their bravery on their sleeves. Chosin carried his tucked away, stitched into every step, every breath. And above them, the cold sky waited. The call came before dawn. Frost clung to the edges of the barracks windows. Breath hung heavy in the air, each man bundling into his flight gear with the kind of slow, deliberate movements that meant they already knew today would be different. Thomas fastened his helmet under his chin, the leather stiff with cold. Chosin stood a few feet away, strapping into his gear, his face unreadable. Outside, the ground crews worked in silence, their boots crunching softly over the ice as they prepared the Corsairs for another mission over the Chosin Reservoir. The Marines on the ground were pinned down, trapped by enemy forces in the frozen hills. Supplies were running low. The wounded couldn't be evacuated fast enough. And from above, the Navy pilots were the thin line between survival and silence. As Thomas climbed into his cockpit, he glanced over to Jesse's plane. Jesse gave a small nod, not a wave, not a salute. Just a nod. Simple. Solid. Enough. The engines roared to life. Propellers blurred into mist. The squadron lifted into the sky, rising through the thin, gray light of morning, the cold seeping into every metal seam. The reservoir sprawled below them like a wound, white and jagged. Smoke curled from distant hills. Down there, Marines fought and froze in equal measure. Up here, in the sky, the pilots fought against the elements just as much as the enemy, navigating blind through patches of mist and clouds, scanning for flashes of fire, for movement, for anything. Thomas stayed close to Jesse's wing, the way they had trained, the way instinct had made second nature. Mission after mission had burned one truth into him: in the sky, trust wasn't optional. It was survival. The radio crackled with terse orders. Cover the perimeter. Watch for enemy movement. Maintain altitude. Be ready. It should have been routine. It should have been another flight like the dozens before it. But there's a way the air feels, sometimes, just before everything changes. It's not something you can see. It's something you know. A tension that hums inside your bones. Thomas heard it in Jesse's voice when he called out, calm but firm. Taking hits. Losing altitude. Thomas's heart clenched. He banked hard, scanning the sky, catching sight of Jesse's Corsair trailing a thin line of black smoke against the gray. Jesse's plane dipped lower, shuddering against the air, fighting to stay aloft. Can you make it to the clearing? Thomas asked, his voice tighter than he meant it to be. Trying, Jesse answered, and even then, there was no panic. Just effort. Just focus. Down below, a patch of frozen ground, a slope leading into a ravine, the only place wide enough for an emergency landing. Jesse lowered the nose of his plane, guiding it toward the makeshift landing zone with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing you have no other choice. Thomas followed, powerless, his heart hammering in his chest, his hands tight around the stick. He watched as Jesse's plane hit the ground hard, skidding through the snow, coming to a jarring stop against a stand of rocks and trees. Smoke began to rise from the wreck. The wind carried it, slow and lazy at first, then heavier. Darker. Thomas circled overhead, shouting into his radio for assistance, for rescue, for anything. But even from the sky, even through the static and the roar of his own engine, Thomas knew one thing before anyone said a word. Jesse was down. And he was alone. Thomas circled above the crash site, his eyes locked on the smoking wreckage below. Every instinct screamed at him to stay airborne, to wait for help, to follow orders. But orders didn't matter right now. Not when Jesse was down there. Not when every second the smoke thickened around the broken Corsair meant Jesse had one less second to survive. The radio crackled in his ear, voices trying to reach him. He didn't answer. Couldn't. His mind was already somewhere else, racing faster than the propellers still churning above him. Permission to attempt rescue, he called out, forcing the words past the knot in his throat. Static filled the headset. A distant voice said no. Too dangerous. Enemy territory. Wait for ground teams. Thomas tightened his grip on the controls. He glanced once more at the wreck, the black smear against the white earth, the helpless figure trapped inside. He could almost see Jesse moving, struggling, fighting against the crushed metal. Waiting wasn't an option. He made the decision without another word. Thomas banked hard, lining up his descent, heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. His Corsair shuddered in the freezing air, fighting him, warning him. The landing strip below wasn't made for planes. It was barely a clearing, barely even flat. Trees clawed at the edges. Rocks jutted out like teeth. But Thomas didn't see the dangers anymore. He only saw Jesse. He brought the plane down rough and fast, the wheels skidding across the frozen ground, the frame groaning under the strain. When he finally slammed to a halt, snow and ice spraying around him, the silence that followed was deafening. Thomas ripped off his harness and stumbled from the cockpit. His boots sank into the snow as he ran toward Jesse's wreck. Every step felt slower than the last. The cold bit into him, stealing the air from his lungs, but he pushed forward. The Corsair was crumpled, the engine still ticking in the cold like a dying heart. Smoke poured from under the nose. Thomas could see Jesse inside, pinned by twisted metal, his face pale but alive. "Hang on, Jesse," Thomas gasped, pulling at the wreckage with frozen fingers. Jesse's eyes opened just a sliver. He tried to speak but coughed instead, a weak, rasping sound that chilled Thomas more than the wind ever could. "I'm here," Thomas said, louder this time, as if volume alone could will strength into both of them. "I'm not leaving you." The metal was warped and unforgiving. No matter how he pulled or pushed, it wouldn't give. Thomas grabbed handfuls of snow, packing them against the engine to try and cool the growing fire underneath. His hands burned from the cold, from the heat, from the helplessness. Above them, the sky stayed quiet. No rescue planes. No reinforcements. Only the endless stretch of gray, and the knowledge that, right now, they were alone. Thomas wiped the sweat and ice from his face with the back of his glove and leaned close to Jesse. "We'll get out of here," he said, steady and certain, even though the sinking pit in his stomach told him the truth. And Jesse, in a voice so faint Thomas had to lean in to hear it, answered with something even stronger than fear. "I know." Thomas dropped to his knees beside the wreck, his gloves already soaked through from the snow. Every breath he took felt like swallowing broken glass. He dug his fingers under the twisted metal, heaving with everything he had, but the cockpit wouldn't budge. Jesse was trapped. Pinned by the crumpled fuselage, his body twisted painfully against the wreckage. Thomas yanked harder, feeling the cold and the smoke mix around him, feeling the futility press harder against his chest. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It wasn't supposed to happen to Jesse. Jesse's voice broke through the thick air, thin and steady. "Not your fault, Tom." Thomas ignored him. He wasn't listening for excuses. He wasn't leaving without Jesse. He clawed at the edges of the canopy, tried to pry it open with the edge of his survival knife, but the cold had welded everything together, a brutal fusion of fire and ice. His breath came in ragged bursts, fogging the air between them. "You hear me?" Thomas said, almost shouting now. "I'm getting you out." Jesse smiled, not the full smile Thomas remembered from the ready room, but a quiet one, tired around the edges. "You tried," Jesse whispered. "That's enough." Thomas shook his head fiercely. "No. It wasn't enough. Trying was for when you still had time. Trying was for stories that ended with medals and safe landings. This was life stripped bare, and trying wasn't going to save it." From somewhere far off, he heard the faint rumble of engines. Maybe rescue planes. Maybe just the wind playing tricks. He didn't look up. He couldn't afford to hope. Hope was too expensive. Thomas pulled his jacket tighter against the biting wind and pressed his body against the side of the wreck, shielding Jesse from the worst of the smoke. The fire below them crackled louder, more insistent. The smell of burning oil filled the air. Jesse's eyes fluttered open again. His voice was so soft now Thomas had to lean in close to catch it. "Tell Daisy. I tried my best." Thomas nodded, even though he didn't know if Jesse could still see him. Daisy. Jesse's wife. Waiting back home. Waiting for a letter, maybe a call, never expecting this. "You'll tell her yourself," Thomas said, but the lie tasted bitter in his mouth. Jesse gave a tiny shake of his head, a final, weary protest. His hand, still trapped against the side of the cockpit, twitched once, then stilled. Thomas pressed his hand against Jesse's arm, willing life into it, willing strength into both of them. The fire crept closer. The sky above them stretched endlessly gray, indifferent. There were no cameras. No crowds. No medals waiting in the wings. Just two men in the snow, fighting a battle no one else would ever see. A battle not against an enemy they could shoot or a storm they could outrun. A battle against time itself. Thomas stayed until the cold numbed his fingers and the smoke blurred the edges of his vision. He stayed long after Jesse's breathing slowed to the shallowest of whispers. He stayed because to leave would have meant surrender. And Thomas Hudner didn't surrender. Not to the cold. Not to the smoke. Not to death. He stayed because somewhere deep down, he understood that Jesse wasn't just a pilot, or a friend, or even a fellow officer. Jesse was the promise he had made to himself a long time ago, that no one would be left behind. Not if he could help it. Not even now. The fire kept creeping closer. Thomas could feel the heat against his back even as the wind whipped around them, slicing through the layers of his flight suit. He knelt beside Jesse, shielding him as best he could, his own breath coming in shallow bursts, each one harder than the last. Jesse's eyes opened again, barely slits against the smoke and cold. His lips moved, struggling for words. Thomas leaned closer, pulling his scarf down from his mouth so Jesse could see his face. "You're not alone," Thomas said quietly. "You hear me? You're not alone." Jesse blinked, a slow, heavy blink, as if it cost him everything just to stay awake. He gave a weak nod, his face tightening in pain. The minutes dragged like hours. Thomas shouted again into his radio, calling for help, for anyone, but the only answer was static and the low growl of the flames behind him. Jesse's fingers twitched against the twisted frame, trying to lift, to move, but he didn't have the strength. His voice, when it came, was almost a breath. "Tell them. I didn't quit." Thomas swallowed hard, fighting the lump rising in his throat. "You didn't," he said. "You never did." Jesse's hands settled back down. His breathing grew slower, more uneven, the cold and the smoke taking their toll. Thomas wiped a layer of soot from Jesse's forehead with the edge of his glove, his movements slow and careful, like a brother smoothing back the hair of a younger sibling. "I'm right here," Thomas whispered. "All the way." A small sound escaped Jesse's throat. Not quite a word. Maybe it was enough. Maybe it didn't need to be anything more. The fire behind them cracked louder. The snow around the wreck was starting to melt, blackened and steaming. Thomas knew they couldn't stay much longer. He knew the rescue teams, if they were coming at all, might not make it in time. He knew the cold would win eventually. Still, he stayed. Jesse's eyes fluttered one more time, and Thomas saw something there, not fear, not regret, but something close to peace. Jesse drew in one last, thin breath. And then, so quietly that it seemed the wind itself carried it away, he was gone. Thomas sat back on his heels, his body trembling not from the cold but from something deeper. He pressed a hand to Jesse's shoulder, holding it there, grounding himself in the simple, brutal reality of what had just happened. No trumpets. No banners. No final words written in history books. Just two men, alone on a frozen hillside, bound by a promise made long before either of them ever set foot on this distant land. The wind picked up, tossing loose snow into the wreck, covering Jesse inch by inch. Thomas stayed a little longer, watching, guarding, until the horizon blurred and the sky grew heavy and dim. Only then, when the last bit of sunlight slipped away behind the mountains, did he rise. Slowly. Silently. And with one last look at the wreck, Thomas turned toward the long walk back through the snow. He left behind footprints that the wind would soon erase. But some things, he knew, would never be erased. Not while he still breathed. Thomas trudged through the snow, his boots sinking deep with every step. The cold gnawed at his bones, but he hardly felt it anymore. His body moved because it had to. His heart stayed behind, back where Jesse lay beneath a shroud of smoke and frozen silence. When he finally reached the rescue teams, he didn't say much. Just a few clipped words, a nod toward the crash site. His face, hardened by wind and grief, said more than any report ever could. The flight back to the base blurred into a haze of engine noise and hollow silence. Thomas sat stiff in his seat, helmet in his lap, staring out at the endless sweep of white below. Someone slapped him on the shoulder when they landed, a rough gesture of camaraderie. He barely noticed. The debriefing was brief, mechanical, as if the story could be boiled down to headings and bullet points. Enemy fire. Forced landing. Attempted rescue. Casualty. But Thomas knew better. Jesse Brown wasn't a casualty. He wasn't a line on a report. He was a husband, a brother, a friend. He was a man who had carved a place in the sky with his own 2 hands, who had carried dignity into a world that hadn't made room for it. The Navy awarded Thomas the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. They dressed him in his formal blues, handed him a citation, took photographs. He stood still, let them pin the medal to his chest, nodded at the right times. But in the small hours of the night, sitting alone in his bunk with the medal heavy in his palm, Thomas couldn't help but feel the weight of something else entirely. He turned the medal over slowly, the edges catching the faint light. He thought about Jesse, the easy laugh, the stubborn set of his jaw, the quiet fire in his eyes. He thought about the promise he had made without even realizing it, that Jesse would never be forgotten, not while Thomas still drew breath. The medal didn't ease the ache. It didn't rewrite the ending. It didn't bring Jesse home to Daisy. All it did was remind Thomas that some acts of loyalty didn't come with neat endings. Some stories stayed unfinished. Some promises stayed alive, carried forward in the quiet choices a man made for the rest of his life. Thomas tucked the medal away in a drawer. He didn't need it to remember. Jesse wasn't a memory. He was a part of the man Thomas would become, every step, every decision, every quiet act of courage that nobody else would ever see. In the years that followed, Thomas spoke Jesse's name wherever he could. He told the real story, not just of the crash, but of the life before it. The struggles. The victories. The way Jesse had opened the sky for everyone who came after. Because carrying a legacy isn't about grand speeches or ceremonies. It's about living in a way that honors the ones who showed you how. And Thomas Hudner carried Jesse L. Brown with him. Always. In every silent salute. In every breath of cold air. In every quiet moment where courage meant standing alone. Years passed. Seasons turned, battles faded, names slipped quietly from memory. But some things refused to be erased. On a cold day, much like the one over Chosin, Thomas Hudner returned to Korea. An older man now. Slower. But carrying the same quiet promise he had made so long ago. He stood on the edge of a frozen hill, near where Jesse's plane had come to rest all those years before. The landscape had changed, roads paved, villages grown, but the wind still sounded the same. Lonely. Enduring. Thomas knelt in the snow, removing his hat, bowing his head. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Some conversations never needed words. In the stillness, he could almost hear Jesse's laugh carried on the wind, feel the stubborn set of his shoulders, see the way he had looked at the sky with wonder, not fear. Thomas brushed his hand lightly across the ground, as if by touching the earth he could bridge the gap of decades, of all the things left unsaid. I didn't forget, he whispered, his voice barely more than breath. For Jesse. For Daisy. For every man who had ever been asked to give everything and walk away without a parade, without a headline. When Thomas stood again, his knees stiff and aching, he didn't feel weaker for it. He felt stronger. Because carrying a legacy isn't about how loud you are. It's about how long you remember. And Thomas had remembered. He turned his gaze to the sky, the same endless sky they had once flown through side by side. He imagined Jesse up there still, cutting clean lines through the clouds, free in a way that neither war nor time could touch. Back home, others would write books, make movies, tell pieces of the story. But Thomas knew the truth wasn't in the speeches or the medals. It was here, in the simple act of standing on a cold hill, remembering a friend. Before he left, Thomas pressed a small set of pilot's wings into the snow. It was a quiet gift. A reminder that some spirits never land. They just keep flying, just beyond sight. And maybe, on nights when the wind howls just right across the hills of Chosin, you can still hear them. Two pilots. Two friends. bound not by fate or orders, but by the choice to stand by one another when it mattered most. Thomas walked away slowly, the snow filling his footprints as he moved. Erasing the path, but never the journey. Because some promises don't melt with the seasons. Some names don't disappear with the years. And some flights never truly end. Courage isn't always a roar. Sometimes, it's a quiet decision, made in the freezing cold, with no one there to applaud, no guarantee of survival, no hope of reward. Thomas Hudner's story reminds us that real courage lives in the moments when standing by someone else costs us everything. He couldn't save Jesse L. Brown from the wreckage, but he refused to let him face his final moments alone. In doing so, Thomas showed us that loyalty, respect, and brotherhood are not measured by success. They are measured by effort, by heart, by the promises we refuse to break even when no one is watching. Through the snow and silence of Chosin, Thomas Hudner carried more than a comrade's memory. He carried the kind of legacy that doesn't fade with time, the kind that reminds us who we are supposed to be, especially when it's hardest. In today's world, where noise and recognition often drown out quiet acts of character, maybe it's time we ask ourselves. Would we have made the same choice? Would we risk everything, not for glory, but for a friend? Who in our lives deserves that kind of loyalty, and do they know it? If this story moved you, if you believe in honoring the unsung heroes who live and love in silence, we invite you to become part of our mission. Please like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories. Because some stories deserve to be remembered. And some legacies are only kept alive when we choose to carry them forward, together.